In this video, I'm going to give you 3 great alternatives for cloud shadow colors other than black and white. Although grays have their place, if you're wanting a more colorful painting, you've come to the right place. Stay tuned for my top 3 colorful shadow tips. The first tip that I have for you is one of my personal favorites, and that is to use the same color in your shadows that you've used for the sky color. In this first example, we're going to use ultramarine blue for the sky, and then I'm going to mix 3 different piles of ultramarine and increasing amounts of white to get 3 very distinct values, and those values are what will be used for the shadow colors. Here's a photo reference from Paint My Photos to give us something to go by for the clouds. Here I'm using an angled brush, and I'm going into that pure ultramarine, so it's a really nice dark blue, full strength, putting that at the top of the sky, and then as we come down closer to the horizon, adding a slight bit more white to that as we go, ending up much lighter when we get to the horizon line. I really like using an angled brush for something like this. It makes it really easy to cut in around those cloud shapes. I'm trying to keep the outside edge of those clouds interesting. Of course, when we put the cloud color in, we're going to be pressing against those edges, so it's not going to look exactly like that, but that's just giving us some white space. And you don't have to do it this way. You can just paint the whole canvas in blue and just let it dry and go over it with the white, whatever you prefer. I'm going back over those top corners, just making sure they're good and dark. I'm adding some golden open medium to the shadow colors, and I think this is really an important step. If you're using acrylics, if you work with acrylics much, you know that they can dry with a really hard edge, and there's some times with clouds where we want a crisp edge, but most of the time we want it to look super soft. So I'm even adding it to the white that's going to be used for the highlights. I'm taking this little thick poly tip brush that's really great for holding a lot of paint, and I'm dropping in the darkest shadow pile, which is not the pure ultramarine, but it's that top pile at the bottom of the clouds and in the center. I'm just looking at my reference photo. Here I'm going back in, I'm dropping in that lightest value, which is almost pure white. One of the most dreaded things that can happen to an artist filming happened to me with this painting, and that is the memory card ran out without warning and the second half of the painting was not caught on film. So I ended up using this little painting for my second tip, but before we get to that, I wanted you to have the full experience of painting the sky color into your shadows. So I decided to do this a second time using a different sky color, cobalt blue. You'll see by this second painting that this works with almost any blue sky color that you choose. But since I'm going to give you some examples at the end with the ultramarine, I thought it was important for you to see the beginning of this video. Here I have cobalt blue on the far left, and I'm doing the same thing that I did with the ultramarine. I'm just mixing 3 values using a little bit more white, and I'm adding slow dry medium to it. Here I'm putting the pure cobalt at the top. Cobalt's really my favorite color. If you want just a pure, strong blue for a sky, I think it's just beautiful, and particularly when you've got white clouds, it's just, it just kind of takes my breath away. So I have penciled out the spaces for the clouds again, and I'm just going back that top, just darkening it one more time, getting those top corners extra dark. They really make the clouds pop when you put them next to something that dark. Here I'm just taking those darkest values and I'm putting them in where I see them in the photograph, and I'm going down to the next value, putting it around the darkest one. Now I'm going to the lightest one, putting on that outside edge, just building out. Just trying, I'm not putting a lot of pressure on the brush. I'm putting things in pretty lightly. If you'll notice, when I'm putting in that outside edge, I'm turning that brush. I'm not putting down even strokes. I'm just very lightly laying in different pressures, getting different brush marks, trying to keep it really loose, soft, organic. In some places, I'm putting the white on the outside edge. On some places, I'm coming down into the cloud. I love those little breakout pieces. I think they're important. So you don't want everything just solid and rigid. You want it to look like it's breaking apart and it's not too thick. There's going to be a place later on to have some thick places in the clouds, but at this stage, I'm just trying to get a light, airy, flowy, some movement to get the feeling that cloud is not just stationary, but there's actually a little movement going on. Some places I'll use more of a pure white. Some places I'll use my lightest little pile that has mainly white but a touch of the blue. That little touch of the blue next to pure white, it's so subtle, but it really makes a big difference. So don't try to limit yourself to just white and dark. You need those different values in between for this to really read correctly. And I'm just adding in a little more, just looking back at my photograph. Barely touching it, really light strokes. Almost letting that brush just sort of kiss the canvas, if you will. I have started using these little canvas boards for my demonstrations, and I just love them. I've been using regular stretch cotton canvas, but I really like painting on this hard surface that doesn't have a give to it. Been really pleased with it. Wish I could do that on something really gigantic. I'm not sure how big they come. Here I'm just very lightly softening these edges where these different values meet, just getting a really soft transition. I'm barely touching the canvas, but because that slow dry medium is in the paint, it's remained very workable. Here I'm using a little flat brush and I'm just dropping in a real simple landscape in the bottom. It's funny how you can do a beautiful cloud scene, but until you put that landscape in, it doesn't really come into its own. I'm using sap green, which is real dark green, and some olive green. I'm putting in a touch of alizarin crimson, which not only helps to darken it, but it helps dulls it a little bit. I want the landscape at the back of the painting where it's touching the sky to just look more like a silhouette, to sort of just give you an impression of a tree line, but I don't want it screaming at you. I don't want it being too bright. So I've got it pretty dark, pretty dulled down, turning my brush, just getting some different strokes, not wanting those to look like little round treetops, but trying to get some variation. And if you'll make the little strokes smaller to one side of the canvas like I have there on the left, it looks like the trees are even further in the distance. It's just such an easy way to get good perspective in your painting. I'm just adding in a little Naples yellow and a little alizarin crimson, a little olive green, a little sap green, just getting in a real rough, putting different things on my brush, a little white mixed in. I'm not overly mixing things on my palette. I'm just picking up different colors on my brush, scrubbing them in, and it just gives a nice loose landscape. Sometimes you get a happy accident there. Something looks even better than you meant for it to. Just really, I love it. Just looks like you've got a great perspective. Getting a little darker in the foreground. The only thing about those little panels, they are a little more difficult to hold on to rather than a full canvas, but still worth it. Tip number 2, another option to keep your shadow colors colorful is to add one additional color to the shadows. For example, if the sky is ultramarine and you have made various shadow colors using ultramarine and white, try adding a touch of a second color. In this example, I've added alizarin crimson plus white. This still provides great color harmony in your painting, but it's going to give you an even greater range of shadow options. In my final tip today in how to have colorful shadows, I want to introduce you to a color that I've discovered that is right out of the tube. It doesn't require mixing, that I use all the time for shadows on not just clouds, but on flowers. I use it in water. I use it on shadows for tabletops. It's just a great all-around colorful shadow color, and it's called Liquitex Light Blue Violet. I have it in the heavy body and also in the basics thinner version. Here we've got the 2 tubes of Liquitex Light Blue Violet that I use in the basics and the heavy body. And I'm using Golden Open Slow Dry Acrylic Medium, and I just put a pile on my palette rather than mixing it in. I've used ultramarine for the sky, and I put in a super simple landscape at the bottom just to give you a feel. This is that same poly tip brush that just holds a lot of paint. It's very stiff. It's worked real well. So I'm just dipping into that light blue violet and into some of the Stay Dry Medium, and I'm just dropping it in pure right out of the tube. Isn't it a beautiful color? And it works so well with different sky colors, I have found. I've just used this so many times, and I can't think of a time when I wasn't pleased with the results. The only other thing I'm going to use with this is some white, just varying degrees of white, going back in that slow dry medium. You know, even with the slow dry medium, these paints got a little dry on this, so you really need this. By the time I got to the end of the painting, the darkest areas had already started to dry, so it's probably better to just mix it into the paints rather than dipping into it separately, but I got a little lazy and just did it that way. I like using a little flat square edge brush to do clouds. I just like the sculptural aspect that it provides. Even though I go back and I soften edges and transitions, it still just gives you kind of a painterly look. I really like it. Putting in an edge that's white with just the tiniest touch of color. I'm wiping that brush off before I go back into the pure white. Now I'll put just a little bit of that blue back in. Just trying to keep the colors real clean. Turning that brush a little bit on those outside edges. Just, you don't want a real straight, smooth edge. Decided it would look better to kind of ground that cloud to the landscape a little bit. Now I'm just dipped into some pure white. There's no tint in that. And dropping in, you want some areas of the clouds to look a little thicker, and putting in that thick solid white, it can give that illusion. You'll notice I'm really just tapping the outside edges just to get a little more irregular shape, just to get some little drops of paint out there. Now I'm wiping that brush off very carefully, and I'm going to just smoothly, I'm barely putting any pressure on that, and I'm just wiping it off so I'm not dragging colors too much into the other colors. I'm just softening those edges because I don't want to lose what I've done. I had thought I was finished with this little painting, but as I got back from it, I felt like it needed a little more activity and interest on the outside, so I got a little bitty brush and I just started adding some little broken off pieces here and there. Just adding a little interest. Again, kind of connecting that to the ground a little bit more. Just going into pure white at this point. This one area looked a little dotty to me, so I went back to my original brush. It was damp, and I'm just very lightly moving it over that paint, just getting that feel that there's just a really super thin wispy cloud, so I don't have hardly any paint. I've got a little bit of dampness on that brush, very, very little pressure, and just dropping in some white. Isn't that lovely? It's just amazing what that can do to the painting, and it's just so easy and so little effort. It's fun. I think it just makes the cloud look a little more believable if it's got some other cloud activity going on around it, rather than just this one lone island sitting out in the sky. It just looks a little more connected, and these broken off pieces. I think that makes a lot of difference. It's really nice when you start getting those white trails up against that bluer sky. So as a quick review, 3 ways that you can keep your cloud shadow colors more colorful is first to use the same color in your clouds that you've used in your sky. The second option is to add one additional color to those shadows. Remember where we added alizarin crimson. And then third, you can try my favorite Liquitex light blue violet, which is absolutely beautiful all on its own. I hope this video was helpful to you. I encourage you to check out my website where I've got courses and paintings for sale. And of course, if you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel, you'll have access to all the great free stuff that comes out frequently. Thanks a lot, and God bless.